From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Welcome to From the Void. I'm your host, John Williamson, and today's mystery is quite an unusual one. Unusual because it covers two separate incidents a decade apart. In the first half, you'll hear my interview with author and researcher William Van Huss, who wrote the book on the 1933 Mad Gasser case. Then we'll cover the incident in 1944, and then we'll cover some possible theories, as neither of these cases was ever truly solved. So let's get to it. This week's mystery, William Van Huss and the case of the Mad Gassers, on From the Void. All right, very excited to have my guest on with me today. William, thank you so much for spending some time with me this morning.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. As we talked about before we started recording, you're one of the few folks who have written extensively on this particular topic, the topic of the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. It's kind of an unusual, lesser-known mystery out there. Tell people a little bit about yourself and how you got into this topic specifically.
Well, for me, I guess ever since I was a kid, I was reading things on unsolved mysteries and, all the stuff about UFOs and the, ghost ships and Jack the Ripper and just all sorts of things like that. So I think I was introduced to it at some point back then where I read just a small, maybe a paragraph or so about it, And then over the years, every time I would see something, it would be just like a little blurb, And then it was after I wrote a book called Saucers Over Appalachia, and it was about the 1973 UFO wave and just how it presented itself in the area that I'm from in Appalachia. And after that, I was kind of thinking about what to write about next, and I guess there was because UFO waves have an element of mass hysteria that usually goes along with it. I was thinking about mass hysteria, and then I thought, the Mad Gasser, because the Mad Gasser always gets put into the category of a mass hysteria event, and really solely, but there's really a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I was researching another topic for another guest, and we'll talk about it a little bit later about how I think there could be a possible connection, and I'd love to get your take on it. But before we get to that part, though, we got to set the stage for listeners. Talk about the time in which this takes place and the location. What was going on at this time, and where did this event occur?
Well, first, this is the first Mad Gasser event. So that you had the one that you hear about the most is Mattoon, Illinois, and that one happened in the 1940s. That was like in the middle of World War II. But the first event is the one that I wrote the book about, is Botetourt County in Virginia, and that's it's the county outside of Roanoke, Virginia, and this was in 1933, so it was about 10 years before the one that gets all the attention from Mattoon. I believe that the one that the reason that the Mattoon event gets all the attention, though, is because shortly after it happened, there were people from Chicago, a town outside of Chicago. There were people from Chicago, from the university, that came there and interviewed people and studied it and wrote it up as a mass hysteria event. And then since that time, in the 50s, 60s, even up until, more recent times, it's been cited in psychological journals and stuff as an example of a mass hysteria event. So I think that's why that one gets all the attention. I mean, if you look it up, you'll find the Wikipedia will say Mad Gasser of Mattoon, although this one occurred before it and was actually occurred much longer than that one, because the Mattoon event lasted about 2 weeks, and the Mad Gasser event in Botetourt County was like about a month and a half, something like that. And but they both do share a lot of common elements. I think I might have gotten away from your question.
No, that's great. Talk about before we get into sort of the comic connections.
The time.
Yeah. So you said the 30s, but who was the first victim, or who was the first person who sort of identified this as a potential person who was out there potentially gassing other people?
Well, it was 1933. So and this is in the the county. It didn't start in the city of Roanoke. So you have to kind of consider the time and place, and we're still much. I know it's difficult. People say all the time, "Oh, this was before the internet," but it's difficult to this is not only before the internet. This is before a lot of things. So at that time, this is mostly rural farming communities, and even a lot of people back then, even though telephones existed, they hadn't reached everywhere, So there was a very big lack of communication. So, you got your news from the newspaper, or you got it via word of mouth. And the first people that were the victims, it was a man named Cal Huffman and his family, and they lived in a house that was outside of Fincastle, which was the county seat in Botetourt County. Very historic town. It's where the Lewis and Clark expedition left from. But he was living in this house because he was working the farm, and him and his family lived there. The house was owned, though, by another man. I think his name was last name was Henderson, and he was the one who actually owned the property, but he didn't live too far away from that property. So people would refer to it as his house, even though he didn't live there, right? So that night, it was, this was one of these snowy. It was right before Christmas, and his wife started smelling some sort of gas coming into the house, and then he smelled it. And then it went away, and then it came back stronger a little bit later. It went away again, and then he said, "Well, he sent his son to go call the police, and to do that, he had to go to someone else's house that was quite a distance away. He went and did that. The police arrived, and of course they couldn't find anything, because they already opened the windows. This was a common problem with the Mad Gasser events in both places. The people have already opened the windows to try to air it out, because your natural instinct or whatever, if there's a gas choking you up, you want to get it out of there. So there was nothing to find, and the police left. After the police left, it came back again for a third time. And then at that point, his daughter was so affected by it that they called a doctor instead of the police this time, and the doctor came. And his daughter was so affected by it, she passed out, and the doctor had to give her CPR to bring her back. So that was the first event. And then it kind of spread from there, and all the early events were in the county until it finally spread to the city.
Wow. So obviously, one isolated event, you can kind of chalk it up to, maybe there's a gas leak or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. But once it starts to spread, talk about, maybe the second victim, and ultimately what does law enforcement think at this point? Do we have someone on the loose who's intentionally doing this to people, or are they still sort of skeptical at this point?
Well, at first, I think they, they considered it a one-off type of thing. Sorry, I'm moving around a little bit. But then it continued to happen, and once it continued to happen, they would bring along a doctor. There was a specific doctor. His name was Breckenridge, I believe. The policeman who was at almost every time it was called, his last name was Lemon, and he would bring the doctor along with him. So they were trying to find any sort of evidence of like what this gas might be, what was happening. Because it did get reported for a few days till after it happened, but you had the next event happen before it was even reported, so and the early ones were I found this out later because there are hints of it, that you can, because like I was just telling you about the first one, that the guy who owned the farm, he lived down the road, but he wasn't the guy who was living in the house who everybody, somebody may have thought he owned it. But I found out later, because I did a talk on it when the book first came out. I did a talk in Botetourt County at the library, and I met some people who were relatives of the families that it happened to, and they told me about that the early victims were all people who were very prominent citizens, So one of them was a magistrate that happened a little bit later. There's an area called Carvin's Cove that now it's a lake that got flooded. Not long after this whole thing happened, really, the order was already in to flood this place and to this little community. The days are numbered when it was happening. But there were a couple of attacks in Carvin's Cove community, and one of those was on a magistrate, So these were all kind of prominent. The earlier ones were kind of prominent citizens, So it could have been the case that this was someone, and I don't know if this is what the police were thinking at the time, because they don't really give any hint of that in their reports. But it could have been the case that this was somebody who had a grudge against prominent citizens.
Now, during this time, obviously, as there are an increasing number of victims who are involved, or at least reporting these events, does anyone catch, what kind of evidence, if any, is found? You mentioned the first victim. There wasn't really any evidence, so to speak, but in later incidents, did they find any kind of footprints, or did anyone cite anyone unusual who was in the area?
Yeah, there are several that where there was evidence when we're still in the county with it. There was evidence of there was a few people that said they saw somebody running away. There was a man who said he saw a man running to get into a car that was the car was sitting on the side of the road running, and this guy ran to get into this car. A little bit later on, around the time that the Carvin's Cove incident happened, which is, I had a big fascination with Jack the Ripper, and it's it makes me think of that for some reason. There was the one time when Jack the Ripper killed 2 victims in one night, and this is kind of like that. What happened? There were multiple events in one night, and it happened in this Carvin's Cove area. And at that point, the police were so ready that they blocked all the roads and stuff off. But they never, because there was only a couple ways in and out of there, so they blocked them off, but they still didn't catch the person. But at that point, they went back to one of the houses, and they found a crank, for how the old automobiles used to start with a crank, and someone had reported, and this crank belonged to an Overland, which was a brand of automobile in the early 1900s. It had already been, I think they had quit making them in the 20s, so it would have been a few years old, the car. There was also a time when somebody saw a woman, or they found a woman's footprints, and there was a time when they found where it appeared at one person's house that the person had been, whoever did it, because it was snow all over the place, the snow was all tamped down, and there was sort of an area where they had been waiting on the people to get home or something. There were other incidents where they found evidence, but this is a little bit later, that were hoaxes. These are things that I think what happened was once it became a big story. And, there was some overlap. There was I think that what happened was originally there was a person doing this, going around to terrorize people. It was a terrorist attack, really. And then there were people, as often is the case with just about everything, there were copycats who were doing it like as a, to just sort of get on to the, like there was a woman who somebody threw something through her window, and it was like a bottle of insecticide that like spilled out all in her house. It was real smelly or whatever, but it was like, obviously that was just a hoax. And then there was another one where somebody put a bunch of brush up to somebody's door and set it on fire. There was ones where people started getting suspicious of everybody. So then there was several incidents where there would be people see a group of young boys, before there was some sort of, like teenagers, before there was some sort of kind of a hoax perpetrated on them. But yeah, as it kind of spread, I think it went through phases, which, oftentimes this happens really with mass hysteria events, and where there's an original event, there's an original thing, then there are the hoaxes, and then there is the mass hysteria actually ensues after that because there's so many.
Yeah, that was kind of the impression when researching the incident in Illinois that sort of felt like the case where, you've got, examples where people saw, potential suspects and there was actual evidence left behind, physical evidence. But then after a while, the police aren't necessarily, gathering any suspects. And so, it's sort of the paranoia and fear sort of spreads throughout the community. And then you start to have people, as was the case there, who are, they're just getting inundated with reports of, people being gassed when, it wasn't the case. Everyone assumes that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think by the time it reached the city of Roanoke, most of those were either mass hysteria or they were somehow hoaxes. Like there was one where somebody had clearly had taken rags and stuffed them under somebody's door, and the rags were soaked in some kind of chemical or whatever. But that's not the kind of thing that would fill a whole house and, knock someone unconscious. That's the kind of thing that would be just enough to scare somebody who was primed to be scared in the first place.
Yeah, and you mentioned the earlier victims. At least there was a thread that kind of connected them all together in the respect that they were all upper class folks. Did the law enforcement, the police, ever have any kind of suspects in mind, or did they ever arrest anyone, or at least question anyone that they thought might be the culprit?
Yeah, actually, they questioned one person who was there was one car that had been seen that was driving with no headlights on, and whoever had seen it at the time, it was in the county on the country roads with no headlights. But so whoever saw that were able to get their license plate, so they gave it to the police, and the police found that person and questioned them, but they released them. They didn't say why. They never gave the person's name. And, when I tried to find out more about that, I was told that the records from that time, the police records from that time, no longer existed, So, unfortunately, we'll probably never know who that person was or if they were the real Mad Gasser,
Yeah. One of the interesting things I wanted to get your perspective on is, and I mentioned this at the top of the interview, was, there are situations that actually happened, and we've seen as more records have been released, or from specifically old CIA operations and stuff like that. There's a really interesting book that I just read about an individual named Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of our you're familiar. Interesting guy. Yeah. So, but we know that the government, specifically, during World War I, we're using various gases, and we're interested in sort of biological weapons, and we're testing these things throughout World War II and then after World War II. And there's, memos, from the CIA that outline these things. And there are examples of where, they tested, different chemicals in aerosol form on unwitting, citizens. There's an example out on the West Coast, I believe it was in San Francisco, where it was, allegedly a harmless bacteria that they spread, but it actually ended up killing somebody who had just gone through some sort of surgery. So, like, we know for a fact that our government and many governments have tested out various agents. So I wonder what your take is on, maybe the incidents in the 30s, and then, even the incidents that were recorded, in Illinois in the 40s, the potential that perhaps this was somebody who was testing potential, military grade gases. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the two times, are, even though they're only 10 years apart, they're a little bit different because, World War I was where, chemical, gases were first used and, weaponized. And the gas that was most common in World War I was chlorine gas, or phosgene gas would be but and in Illinois, we were in the middle of a war, so the paranoia was really high, and it was well known that gases could be used and stuff like that. But in the first incident, in the at least the evidence of what gas it was, there are several different reports and possibilities. Now, chlorine gas was mentioned by one of the doctors, that he thought it smelled like chlorine gas. And chlorine gas, someone with just a rudimentary knowledge of chemistry could come up with some chlorine gas, because bleach was already around, there were other gases that were suggested. That there was one called, they called it chicken gas, but it was, what it is it's this carbon dioxide, and back in the day, and maybe they'd still do it, they would, like at slaughterhouses, they would take carbon dioxide gas and fill the chicken coops with it and put the chickens to sleep before they slaughtered them. It's a little bit more humane, I guess, to do. And so they thought that maybe it was that, which would make sense in such a rural setting, that maybe somebody who was thinking that, somebody who wasn't wrapped too tight, that thought that, well, I'm going to put all these people, you'd have to know their motivations, I guess, a little bit, because, were they thinking, I'm going to put all these people to sleep and then I'm going to do something, and then it just didn't work, and then there's also, there were several gases. Formaldehyde was smelled at one time. But that doesn't mean that necessarily that they're different, that everybody's mistaken about what they're smelling, or that, that there's no evidence. It could mean that whoever was perpetrating it was trying out different things, or modifying it as they went along, because they were trying to get a certain result that they weren't getting, As far as the government, or any sort of government involvement or having to do with either of these episodes, I don't know. I wouldn't put anything past them. So if knowing what I know about, things like MK Ultra or Operation Northwoods, or, all these other million other different things that they've done in the past, I wouldn't put anything past them. But I would expect it to probably be a little bit more, I don't know, maybe a little bit more widespread, or I would expect worse results, maybe, like that people died, because nobody really died. There were people that were, there was one gas that they thought that could have been used. I can't remember which one it was, but it was because there was a fabric. Oh no, that was formaldehyde. There was a fabric textile mill there, and they used formaldehyde in the making of the fabrics. So somebody who worked there could have gotten that, So whoever was doing it, I think that probably it's a good possibility that they were modifying and trying to get to some sort of result that they never really got to, maybe.
Yeah, talk a little bit about. You mentioned that there were some links between the two incidents. What were those links, and then ultimately, do you think the two were connected at all, or were these two completely separate, isolated events?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, the links between them would just be the circumstantial evidence of that they both like had very similar. They presented themselves very similarly. It's entirely possible that somebody could have done this in Botetourt County, moved to Illinois, and then did it again 10 years later, try to do it again. Who knows? But it's also possible that somebody could have the seed could have been planted in their mind because they read about the Botetourt County incident. And I'd read people before who had written about, small things about the Botetourt County episode, and they had said that, like, well, there's no way that anybody could have known because it wasn't reported out of the area. But there are a couple different articles that were picked up by the AP and were circulated. I don't know if they were circulated in the newspapers in Illinois, but they were picked up by the AP, so that's wide circulation. So it's entirely possible that somebody could have read that, and then sort of bookmarked it in their mind. And then whenever they came to to try to do their little terrorist acts or whatever, they've thought about this. And of course, it would have been much more easy to think about something like that in in the time of World War II as opposed to 1933, which it was a very novel thing in 1933. It had never been done before, And as a matter of fact, since then, it's been, there have been instances since then. Most recently, there was one probably like 6 years ago or so in Ohio where somebody used and this is like 6-7 years ago or something. Somebody used a drone to like fly up to people in front of their face and spray gas on it. Spray some kind of gas out of it. And I remember reading about that one. Somebody sent it to me, and I remember reading about that one. I wanted to follow up. There was never any follow up on it, like of them doing it more than once. But it makes sense because now they use drones for to spray crops. So it makes sense that like it seemed the Mad Gassers seem to have been like, as many crimes are. They couldn't have existed without the technology of the time. So people are always on top of what the new thing is in order to perpetuate some crime, and they're always on top of what the law enforcement is after them. They know what the law enforcement is looking for, so they can curb that. So on one hand you could say, oh well, nowadays in the sort of surveillance state that we live in, with cameras everywhere, everything's being recorded all the time, then, if someone could never do that, they could never perpetuate that type of crime now. But, criminals are criminals, and they know what to expect, just like with Jack the Ripper, like they implemented fingerprinting, like it was like right after the last murder. So, had they implemented it before, there might have been a small window where he didn't know, and they could have gotten him on fingerprints, if he had a record. But had he known that the fingerprinting existed, he would have taken measures against that,
Yeah, absolutely. It's constant evolution, and it's just interesting to see, modern technology, they're using a different delivery system essentially, and kind of take some of the risk out of it because then the human being isn't present at the scene of the crime, and they could be potentially miles away. So that's interesting. I live in Ohio, by the way. So.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, watch out.
Yeah. I'm going to be keeping one eye over my shoulder at all times now. So,
well, there was also the recent, the thing when in Israel, with the Israel Mossad or whoever that was, blew up all those people's pagers.
Yeah,
like that's just another example of you're using a technology to do something that you could not have ever done before.
Yeah, it's remarkable that even back in those days to think about an explosive device that's that small, that you could put inside of a pager is just crazy to think about. But
Yeah.
So tell people real quick, where can they go to get a copy of the book if they want to read more on this topic?
Well, it's available on Amazon and also from our Etsy shop that we have for our company. It's called Mystic Novelty that we do. We make all kinds of different things, so I sell it on there, and then you can also get it from Amazon.
Perfect. Well, we'll have all the links in the show notes. Just want to say again, thank you so much for coming on and talking a little bit about this very unusual mystery that I think not many people know about, but once you kind of read into it, you're like, this is one of the weirder unsolved mysteries of all time, maybe.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a very, it's one of those mysterious true crime things that's just never been solved and possibly never will be solved. But, we can always learn something about it, particularly about mass hysteria and the nature of crimes like this.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on. Folks, go grab a copy of the book. As I said, links will be in the show notes. Go buy a copy and learn more about it. So let's talk about some potential theories and explanations. The big one that was used to kind of blanket over both situations, the one in 33 and the one in 44, was mass hysteria. Specific to the incident in Illinois, Mattoon Police Chief C.E. Cole basically eventually attributed the entire event to mass hysteria. He suggested that shifting winds from a local war plant caused the odors. The main implicated plant, called Atlas Imperial, denied responsibility. They cited recent safety certifications and the fact that it was very improbable that their chemicals could have potentially caused such effects. As they said, factory workers surely would have experienced the physical effects first before the winds would have theoretically carried the chemical fumes into town. So, if that doesn't seem probable, then what is the other most prevalent theory? The other most prevalent theory is that the truth falls somewhere in the middle, meaning that the initial attacks were legitimate and then followed by mass panic. But the cause for these initial attacks has never been known for certain. Which brings me to my third theory, one that I have not yet heard, and one that's going to sound like a government conspiracy theory, but I'm asking you to hang on and bear with me. So what if one, if not both, of the Mad Gasser incidents were products of our own government's research on chemical weapons? I know, it sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, but hang with me here for a second. First, let's talk about our government's relationship to chemical weapons and chemical warfare. So, early turn of the century, we have World War I. And we know that in World War I, that was largely the introduction of chemical weapons and chemical warfare. And we know that our government, much like governments around the world, were very interested in studying the various chemicals and chemical weapons to ensure that they weren't falling behind their enemies and also trying to find ways to protect themselves against their enemies. As such, we know that the United States Congress made the Chemical Warfare Service, or CWS, a permanent part of the Army back in 1920, with duties to continue, quote, the investigation, development, manufacture, or procurement and supply of all smoke and incendiary materials, all toxic gases, and all gas defense appliances. We also know that between 1930 and 1941, the CWS focused its efforts on refining its production of chemical warfare agents and developing better delivery systems. And remember, the Mad Gasser and Virginia incidents are reported in 1933 and the Illinois incidents in 1944, both occurring long after the military is in full swing in studying chemicals and how to deliver them. We can also see that once the U.S. enters World War II in 1941, the military very quickly boosts its infrastructure by building numerous chemical munitions plants, testing grounds, and defense equipment production plants all over the country. We also know for a fact that even after the end of World War II, that the interest in chemicals and how chemicals may be used in open warfare as well as espionage only increased due to the Cold War. There was actually a 1951 CIA memo that lists multiple questions for the U.S. scientists to ask their German and Japanese counterparts, such as, quote, how can drugs be best concealed in a normal or commonplace item, such as candy, cigarettes, liquor, wines, coffee, teas, beer, gum, water, common medicines, Coke, and even toothpaste. Even more interesting is a memo from early 1955 written by the head of the CIA's Poison and Mind Control Program, Sidney Gottlieb, that shows further interest in researching substances and materials that, quote, will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way so that they may be used for malingering, etc. Substances which produce physical disablement, such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. Substances which will promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. A knockout pill, which can be surreptitiously administered in drinks, food, cigarettes, as an aerosol, etc., which will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agent types on an ad hoc basis. The CIA even had a manual that walked agents through how to administer poisons without detection, including how to best use the advancing aerosol technology. So if we know for an absolute fact that not only was the government already working on chemicals and ways to deliver chemicals as far back as World War I, and the fact that we know for certain that the U.S. government experimented on unwitting citizens on numerous occasions, both on an individual basis and entire populations, would it be a stretch to think that the incidents of 33 and 44 could have been part of a larger government study? In conclusion, the Mad Gasser incidents of Botetourt County and Mattoon remain shrouded in mystery. While mass hysteria offers a plausible explanation, the context of World War II and documented government experiments suggest alternative possibilities. These events reflect the era's paranoia and the complex interplay between the societal fears and government actions. Further research into declassified documents and historical records may shed light on these enigmatic occurrences. So in the end, was it a case of mass hysteria? I think it's relatively safe to say that many of the later reports were due to public panic, spurred on by the reports in the local media. But that doesn't quite explain the original reports and the very real physical effects they were treated for. My personal feeling is that in both cases, the Mad Gasser incidents in both 1933 and 1944 likely had a basis in some very real attacks, followed by many more false reports in the days and weeks after. So if there was a real Mad Gasser, who was it and what was the motive? For me, the fact that both incidents occurred during a time when there was a heightened amount of general anxiety due to 2 world wars and a desire to stay one step ahead of our enemies when it came to a relatively new weapon of war, may be part of the answer. Thanks for listening to From the Void. Hopefully you enjoyed this mystery. We'll be back with an all-new one next week. Until then, rate, review, and subscribe, and don't forget to tell a friend. And until then, I've been your host, John Williamson, and this has been From the Void.